In this presentation, we're going to be talking about the technical adequacy of an intervention and the contextual fit. These are factors that affect whether an intervention is just something written on a piece of paper or whether it's something that actively results in changes in a student's life and consequently changes in a student's behavior. And we'll talk about the different factors that go into that. There's a really interesting study done by Benezzi in 2005. What they did with this study is they looked at school-based teams in which behavior specialists were involved. And they compared different ways in which behavior support plans were developed. One way was for the teams to develop behavior support plans without a behavior specialist involved. Another model was for the behavior specialist to simply take the information from a functional behavior assessment and develop a plan. And then the third model was for the teams with the behavior specialist as part of the team to develop an intervention. I think you can see all three of these models used in schools in different places. I certainly have. Once these interventions were developed, different behavior specialists evaluated the plans to determine how adequate they were technically, and also the extent to which they fit the context. So they did the contextual fit scale, which you have a copy of on the Blackboard site. What they found was the behavior support plans that were developed by the behavior specialists were rated low in contextual fit. So they might have technically had all the parts they needed, and the interventions might have matched the function, but they didn't necessarily fit the context in which they were going to be implemented. By contrast, the behavior support plans that were developed by the teams without a behavior specialist rated low in technical adequacy. The interventions didn't always match up to functions that had been identified, or the reinforcement plans were not developed such that they were beginning at a level where the student was, or the alternative behaviors didn't match the function. The best ones were, as you might expect, the ones that were developed by the teams working with a behavior specialist. They were rated higher in technical adequacy and in contextual fit. So I think this makes a pretty strong statement for the importance of teams working together. I've seen this model done for many years where a consultant sort of swoops in, does some observations, and develops a plan, and then turns it over to people to implement it. And I've seen that happen enough to know that it simply doesn't work. I stopped working that way a long time ago, and if I'm asked by a school to do something like that, I will not accept it because I know it's not an effective way to develop interventions. The only way I'll get involved is if I can come in and work with a team, and if I can have some follow-up once an intervention's been developed, because there are always changes that need to be made. This is a proposed model for how the FBA process should look. It doesn't have to look this way, but this is one that I found to be particularly effective. First one is having an initial meeting. The initial meeting is to gather everyone together, decide who is going to do what parts of a functional behavior assessment, who's going to gather the information, who's going to do the interviews. Once the interviews have been conducted, who is going to sit down and determine what kind of data needs to be gathered, who's going to do the observations, and when. So you have to get some initial information, then do some observations. Usually that process takes about 2 weeks. It's pretty time intensive, and it can be rather labor intensive. So you're only going to do this with students for whom other kinds of interventions haven't worked. So sometimes a little bit less, but usually about 2 weeks to gather the information. After 2 weeks, you come back together and you have a behavior support meeting. This is when the team gets together, looks at all of the data. I like to use whiteboards or smart boards, or even better if you have them, put everything up on the boards. I will draw competing behavior diagrams the way that you did for your assignment. I've done efficiency analyses when we look at alternative behaviors and what it's going to take to compete with challenging behaviors. For the next 2 weeks after this meeting, the team is involved in the implementation process. We'll take a look at what the implementation process is. It takes some planning to put together a schedule of implementation for a behavior support plan. Usually you're not going to put all those pieces into effect at the same time on the same day. Sometimes it might happen over several days. And you have to plan how this is going to occur, who's going to be responsible for different parts. And you have to decide what kind of data is going to tell you whether or not you have the kind of effect on the behavior that you're looking for. After an initial period of, fairly short period of time, maybe 2 weeks, there needs to be another meeting to come back together, look at the initial data, and this is almost always a time when you see mistakes that you made. Regardless of how good your functional behavior assessment data is, you always learn a lot more once you start to implement an intervention. So this second follow-up meeting is always critical to fine-tuning an intervention. In my experience, this usually involves simplifying the intervention. We realized that maybe we got a little too carried away when we were developing the plan, or maybe we missed something entirely. Maybe we misjudged the function of a behavior. And sometimes we learn just through the process of implementing an intervention that we weren't quite right. So this second meeting is often left out, but it's critical. Once that occurs, you almost always have a better plan. It's usually more practical. It's gotten a lot of the kinks worked out. There needs to be some kind of ongoing review process because that plan is usually changing. As the student begins to improve, often the priorities change. Something that was not a priority behavior in the beginning because the student had more severe problems becomes a priority because now we've gotten the more dangerous or the more disruptive behavior out of the way. Sometimes the functions of behavior change, or behaviors may serve multiple functions sometimes, and we identified one but we didn't identify the other. So some kind of ongoing evaluation is critical. Once we have a plan in place, then our attention focuses to the level of supports that enable us to have accurate and durable implementation of the interventions. In other words, are the interventions going to be implemented the way they were intended? And are those practices of implementing the intervention going to stay in place? Are people going to continue to implement it? The factors that we need to consider, first of all, are contextual fit. If you haven't taken a look at the contextual fit document, take a look at that. I'm not going to go through it in the presentation because I think it would just make more sense for you to just look at it yourself. It's fairly simple, but it looks at a number of key issues. I think this is very important to ensuring that the plan fits the context in which it's going to be implemented. The other issue is organizing responsibilities of the professionals who are going to be doing different parts of the intervention. Another factor is embedding the interventions in the student's IEP. As you've seen throughout this semester and in other courses, effective behavior intervention almost always involves teaching new skills. These students have learned ineffective ways of getting their needs met. One of the benefits of a functional behavior assessment, it enables us to pinpoint specific skills that the student needs to learn. Because we're talking about skill development, those need to be embedded with the IEP as well. Also, if there's a school-wide positive behavior support plan, individual plans should be tied in with that to the extent possible or whatever extent they can be, because this is going to make implementation much more efficient. Many of you have talked about motivation systems that are in place in your schools. If you're going to have an individual student motivation system, it makes all the sense in the world to tie that in with the school-wide system. Let's talk about some of the factors that are considered in the assessment of a contextual fit. As you'll see on the instrument, it covers a number of different areas. The first one is, are the implementers, or those who are going to be involved in actually carrying out the plan, are they involved in designing the plan? If they're not, that's a very serious problem. Does the plan meet the values of these people? In other words, is the plan consistent with the values of the individuals who are going to be carrying it out? If it isn't, this is something that has to be considered very carefully. Is the plan consistent with the skills of those who are doing the implementation? If the plan isn't, you have two choices. You can change the plan, or you can teach the skills to those who are going to implement it. Sometimes it takes a little bit of both to make that work. Is the plan consistent with the resources of those implementing it? An intervention plan that involves using a DRO and reinforcing a student every 30 seconds is not going to work if you have a kindergarten teacher that has 25 students. The intervention has to make sense in the context in which it's going to be implemented. I always tell folks who are involved with a plan, consider this. Could you implement this plan every day for a week? And with the other responsibilities that the person who is going to be carrying it out is going to have. Is the plan consistent with the administrative structure? You know, is it a plan that is going to be supported by the administration? And finally, is the plan perceived as something that's likely to work or is in the best interest of the student? If the people who are in charge of implementing the intervention on a daily basis do not perceive this intervention as something that's in the best interest of the student with whom they work, they are very unlikely to carry it out. And I've seen this happen many, many times. This is why it's extremely important that everyone who's involved with an intervention understands why it's been developed and why it's important that those folks have input. If they have questions about a part of the intervention, those questions all need to be addressed. Those people need to be heard. When it's time to actually start implementing an intervention, there are a lot of things that should be considered. I find that it's extremely useful to actually develop a schedule as to how something's going to be put in place. First of all, I never implement interventions on Thursdays or Fridays. I usually will wait for Monday morning or Tuesday morning to implement something. And the implementation is usually something that takes place over a couple of days. The schedule should be drawn out. You know, what are the preparation activities? If you're using self-monitoring sheets or visual materials, who's going to develop the materials? Where are the backup copies going to be kept? How's communication going to work? If you're in a middle school or a high school, how are you going to handle communicating across locations? If the plan involves teaching the intervention to different staff people, or certainly teaching skills to the student, if you're going to teach self-monitoring skills or social skills, when are those times going to be scheduled and who's going to do it? Also, what kinds of data systems are going to be put in place? Who's going to maintain those? Who's going to collect the data? Who's going to summarize it? Who's going to make sure that there's always a data sheet there? And how is assessment going to take place on an ongoing basis? Who's going to tabulate the data? Who is going to share the information with those doing the implementation? That's a piece that often gets left out. The people who are actually carrying out the intervention don't actually see the results of the intervention. Let's take a look at the plan for implementing intervention. This is just an example of an implementation plan. So you have the tasks on one column, the person or people who are responsible for the implementation in another column, and then you have a target date, and then you have a date at which you're going to review, and then a date by which you're going to evaluate the outcome. A simple sheet like this can be very effective to making sure that you stay on track for implementation. When I'm involved in implementing an intervention and working with the staff who are going to be working with the student, I always have a list of questions I go through, and I got these from Rob Horner. I was actually involved in a training project that Rob Horner ran back in the 90s, and that was a great opportunity. He was a really cool guy to work with. But the first one is, who's implementing each part of the intervention? You may even want to draw up a table to divide these things up. Who's going to be responsible? How do people implement it? Does it require some kind of specific instruction or modeling? The answer to this is almost always yes. If you're going to teach a student self-monitoring, for instance, you're going to have a prompting sequence that you're going to use to ensure that the student is becoming independent. It's very important that everyone who implements that intervention is going to use the same prompting sequence. If you're going to use something like redirection, it means you're going to ignore some behaviors and at the same time prompt the student to do something else. It's extremely important everyone does that the same way. If you're going to teach a communication skill that is going to take the place of some challenging behavior, everyone has to know that you prompt the student to use the skill in the situation in which the challenging behavior is going to occur, but never right after the challenging behavior occurs. I mean, there are always a lot of subtle details, and I find modeling and role-playing is a very effective tool to teaching people to implement an intervention. Have people take turns being the student and being the person implementing it. You learn, you get a different appreciation when you role-play being the student and you've had the intervention implemented on you. It gives you a very unique perspective. One of the jobs I had, the director required us all to be involved in role play situations, and we all had to feel what it felt like to be on the other end of our interventions. It does give you a unique perspective, and I think it's a very valuable thing to do. The other question is, when should the intervention be implemented? Very rarely do I start new interventions all day long on the first day. I find that I'll target a couple of situations for a few days, and usually that's where you realize that there's some things that need to be changed. Once things have been fine-tuned, then we look at implementing it into other parts of the day. This is a really important question. It's important that you begin an implementation where you think it's most likely to be successful. Also, if you have folks who are not quite on board, an effective way to get people on board is to show that something is effective in other situations, and it's much harder for people to justify why they're not willing to do something if a student's very successful with it in other situations. Always have a plan for what if the intervention doesn't work. Usually this is a short-term plan. If the intervention isn't working, obviously you need to go back and take a look at your intervention and change it. But in the meantime, you still have the student there every day. You need a plan for how you're going to follow up. What are you going to do on a short-term basis? Ideally, this is going to be something that is going to minimize any kind of risk of anyone getting hurt, and at the same time, it's going to minimize the amount of reinforcement that challenging behavior is getting. If our intervention isn't decreasing a behavior, the last thing we want to do is increase it. So we want to be sure that we're not making the problem worse, but we have an effective way of dealing with it in the short term. The next question, why should this work? Absolutely everyone who is involved with an intervention needs to have a very good understanding of why each part of that intervention is important. Never ask someone to do any kind of intervention without giving that person the benefit of understanding why it's important. I think this is the single most important piece as to why interventions are not often carried out. People are not given the benefit of understanding why this decision was made. Of course, involving everyone in the process of developing the intervention will help ensure that this doesn't happen also. Also, folks need to know that the plan is going to be reviewed periodically, so the decision should be made right away when you're going to meet again to assess whether or not something needs to change. Anytime I implement something, I will usually give folks a timeline of 2 weeks. At the end of 2 weeks, we'll assess whether or not this intervention is working. When you do have the review meeting to assess whether or not the intervention is working, make sure that you look at every component of the intervention. Is each part being implemented the way it was intended? If it isn't, then it's really very difficult to assess whether or not the plan isn't working. So if something isn't working, then you have to ask the question, or in other words, if something isn't being implemented, you have to ask the question as to why. Did we put this in place so that we can assess it? So what parts are being implemented, and reviewing the data, is the intervention having the effect that we wanted it to have? If it isn't working, then why? At this point, you should have enough data that you can start working on those reasons. This is a flow chart that summarizes some of the things we've been talking about. First of all, you have the initial functional assessment behavior intervention plan meeting. And the questions are, does the behavior intervention plan include interventions that address the function of the behavior? Does it manipulate antecedents to prevent the problem behavior? Does it teach alternative behaviors? And does it reinforce desired behavior? Those components should all be very familiar to you by now. If the answer to that's no, then you revise the plan. Those are the pieces that have to be into any effective behavior intervention plan. If the answer is yes, then you do a plan for implementing the intervention, and you plan on collecting 2 weeks of data to determine if your intervention is having the desired effect. The behavior intervention review meeting, you ask the question, do you have data? If the answer is yes, then based on the data, is the plan working? Of course, if the answer is no, then you have to look at why you don't have data. What are some of the barriers to collecting data? Chances are, if you don't have data, the intervention is probably not being implemented as well. But you do have data. The question is the plan working? If the plan isn't working, then you have to ask the question, is it being implemented as it was intended? If it is working, then you look at how do you fade the intervention. I mean, the purpose of any intervention is eventually to eliminate the need for itself. You want the student to be able to function without the aid of some kind of intervention. There's a chance to celebrate too. I mean, it's important that you recognize everybody who's involved. Rob Horner actually told me this once. You know, it's important when you are working with a team of people, give everyone implementing the intervention the credit for anything that works, and always accept the responsibility if it isn't working. And those are usually very good guidelines to go by. It's especially important, though, to recognize people who are working hard and trying to help your students. If it isn't being implemented as it was designed to, then you have to look at the barriers to implementation. What are things that you need to be put in place to make the implementation more consistent? Do you need to retrain people? Do you need to look at acceptability issues? Is it an issue of misjudging the resources that would enable you to implement the plan? What you want to come out of this with is a system that is going to identify any problems as they are occurring and make changes. You never want an intervention to be on paper that is not being carried out in real life. What that does is that creates a culture within a school in which interventions have no value and they have no relation to actually what happens with the students. This is just an item that I pulled from the assessment of contextual fit, and it has to do with the perceptions of folks as to whether or not the intervention's working. If you're not going to do the whole assessment, at least pull these items out and have people respond to these pretty frequently. The first item is, to what level did we implement the plan as proposed? And you rate that on a scale of 1 to 6. And then, to what degree is this plan having a positive impact on the student? If people are consistently implementing the plan to a high degree, and even if your data is showing that the intervention is having the effect you want, if people who are implementing the plan perceive that it is not having a positive impact on the student, it is very unlikely they're going to continue to implement the intervention in the long run. So this can help identify some problems pretty early on, and you would need to follow up with those folks and find out why is it their perception is that this isn't having a positive impact. Sometimes it's a matter that you haven't identified the best form of data to collect, and there are other issues going on that your data is not capturing. To illustrate some issues with implementation, I wanted to talk about a couple of examples that were published in some research studies. This was a study by Knoll. It's about 15 years old, but it's a very interesting study. There were 3 elementary school teachers in a public school, and they all expressed some concerns with students turning in work inconsistently, issues with noncompliance. They were worked with a behavioral consultant that developed some interventions. The intervention involved using some self-monitoring forms with students and some other kinds of reinforcement approaches so that there was an actual physical product from the implementation. In other words, the teachers didn't really have to collect data on themselves, but by implementing the interventions, they would produce some products that could be measured later. And the consultant set it up so that each step in the intervention would result in the teacher actually producing some kind of physical product. So the data they were interested in was really how many of these steps or what percentage of steps did the teachers actually implement. They did a study that had different phases. In the first phase, the consultant did what typically happens. She or he met with the teacher, explained the intervention, gave them some data collection forms, and basically, here's the plan, implement it. And that went into effect for a period of time. After, well, you'll see the graph in just a second. Initially, all the teachers started out really involved in implementing the interventions, but as you would expect, over time, that went down pretty quickly. So after a period of time, the consultant came back and implemented another phase. In this phase, the person met with the teacher every morning for just a few minutes, shared some data with her or him, I think these were all three ladies, but shared some data with the teacher and identified any problems or issues that were observed in the data. Also, the consultant gave some positive feedback to the teachers on things they did correctly. So this was only 3 to 5 minutes every day. And then there was finally a maintenance phase where the person wasn't going to be coming back, but asked them to continue to collect data and said that they were going to continue to evaluate them. So the data is really interesting. What we see here is in the beginning, if you look at the first phase of each graph for the three teachers, you should recognize this, by the way, as a multiple baseline across subjects design. Percentage of treatment steps completed was pretty high in the beginning, but as we go through, it becomes more variable, goes up and down a little more, and then it starts to drop off for each person. The next phase, performance feedback, and remember this is just 3 to 5 minutes every morning. With the implementation of performance feedback, it goes up really dramatically. And it stays that way. And in the maintenance phase, it's for some teachers it drops off again, others it stays pretty high. So what does this tell us about the implementation of interventions and when we're working with classroom assistants or general education teachers? What should we do to ensure that people are going to continue to carry out interventions? It takes prolonged ongoing interaction with folks, and it also takes sharing data with people. So this is just a summary of the results. All the three teachers had high levels of treatment integrity in the beginning. That decreased, but it went back with performance feedback. And then there were some moderate levels that were maintained in maintenance. So this was a really important study for me, and it affected the way that I worked with folks. I think it's important to give people continued feedback, and I've noticed once I started doing that, I saw a change in the consistency with which people implement interventions. This was an interesting study by Jones, Wickstrom, and Furman in '97. Has to do with the interactions between behavioral consultants or behavior teams and teachers. And it's the issue that sometimes when we talk with folks, whether we're talking with general ed teachers or other professionals, I've experienced this myself, what we're really suggesting that people do is change their behavior. And this is a new concept to some people. It's like, well, hey, my behavior's fine. I want you to fix this kid. But what we uncover with functional behavior assessment is very often behavior is being reinforced by something that we're doing. If we want to change the behavior, our only tool is to change our behavior. Often what we're asking people to do is something that's going to require more effort than what they're doing now, at least in the short term. This study involved 3 students who were receiving specialized treatment in the Boys Town for Youth program for kids with severe behavioral difficulties. There was a 12-year-old white female, 11-year-old African American male, and an 11-year-old white male. The intervention in the study was extremely simple. Provide more frequent positive attention to students for expected behavior, provide praise and approval statements and mark a child's daily point card, provide positive feedback to students at least once every 2 minutes for on-task behavior, and ignore students' passive off-task behavior. Though pretty simple as interventions go, and these are actually things that we would consider to be just effective classroom management practices. What we see on this graph is it's actually a graph of the teacher's behavior. To the far left, you see the baseline condition, so it's showing the percentage of 2-minute intervals in which the teachers delivered contingent reinforcement, which is pretty low. Then we have the phase change line, and we have the consultation model. So this is where the consultant is giving the teachers some guidelines on delivering positive reinforcement. And we see that it goes up some, but then we see with performance feedback, when teachers actually got feedback on what they were doing, we really see this improving for all three of the teachers. This graph just shows the on-task behavior of the students and how it differed across the different conditions. It also shows the graph of the treatment integrity during baseline, the consultant, and performance feedback conditions. So if you look at the integrity, you really see a dramatic change going from the consultant model to performance feedback. And this is some of the same data presented in a table form because it's easier for some folks to follow. But for the three teachers, these are the percentage of 2-minute intervals with in which they delivered reinforcement for on-task behavior in baseline, consultation, and with performance feedback. And again, you see a big increase in the delivery of reinforcement from consultation alone to the performance feedback condition. So again, this illustrates the importance of giving performance feedback. So, to sum up, it's extremely important when you implement an intervention, first of all, make sure that everyone who's involved with implementing the intervention understands each component of the intervention and knows how to implement it. Modeling and role-playing is the best method for teaching these things. Having people play the role of being the student and the person implementing and trading roles is the most effective strategy. Once you do that, people are going to remember every part of the plan in a way they would never get from just reading something over. Also, performance feedback is essential for long-term implementation. If possible, involve some kind of permanent product. Most of you in your final projects, I've noticed you're using things like point sheets or rating forms. Those are important for a number of reasons. They give visual feedback to a student, but it's also a permanent product that the intervention was implemented. Also, daily email reminders or having some way to communicate with folks on a regular basis is really important. I think the best way is personal contact. I think there's nothing that would substitute from checking in with someone periodically. If that's difficult, though, electronic communication can still be good, or even using Skype or some other method. Follow-up phone calls can be important as well. You know, I was once told by someone that I respected a lot, never ask anyone to collect any kind of data that he or she is not personally going to use to make some kind of decision. That made a lot of sense to me when someone told me that about 18 years ago. It was actually Rob Horner that told me that. And I have tried to follow that ever since then, and it's made a huge difference. At the same time, I've tried never to ask anyone to carry out any kind of intervention unless he or she understood why that intervention was important. When I visit schools and I see people implementing interventions, sometimes I will ask them why they're doing it, and I get some interesting answers sometimes. What I have noticed, though, almost without exception, if the person implementing the intervention can give me a very thoughtful, reasonable response as to why it's important, I notice a qualitative difference in the way in which they implement the intervention. It's something that they internalize and they actually view it as being an effective tool by which they're going to help their student. Someone who will give me kind of a vague answer, that person you can tell is just going through the motions. They really don't understand why it's being done, but it's sort of something that somebody got upset with them when they didn't do. So they just sort of go through the motions. Going through the motions of something and actually doing something for real as though it's very important, is a very different experience from the student. And it's the difference between an intervention actually working and something having no real effect. We want the interventions that we develop and we put the time into to have the maximum opportunity to work for our students by ensuring that they are going to fit the context in which they were designed, by ensuring that people who are going to carry them out understand them, and by ensuring that people get feedback on a regular basis. We're going to make the most of the interventions that we're developing.